Somewhere in a museum storage room, a jar of honey sealed inside an Egyptian tomb for over 3,000 years was opened by researchers, and it was still edible, not spoiled, not fermented into something dangerous. Still, technically honey. That single fact should break your brain a little, because nothing else in your kitchen survives 3 millennia. But here's the part that should really unsettle you. Doctors today are pulling that same honey, or something chemically identical to it, out of ancient jars of knowledge and using it in hospital wound wards on infections that modern antibiotics have already lost it against. We built machines that can sequence a genome in an afternoon, and we're still, in certain desperate cases, going back to a jar of something a Bronze Age healer would have recognized on sight. So here's the real mystery of this video. Not how did ancient people survive without medicine, because that framing already assumes they were helpless. The actual question is stranger. Why does so much of what they figured out, with no microscopes, no germ theory, no concept of bacteria at all, keep turning out to be correct? Let's start with the strangest piece of evidence first, because it changes everything that comes after. In the 1860s, a British surgeon named Joseph Lister proposed something that sounds obvious now. Maybe doctors should disinfect their hands and instruments before touching a patient. Before that idea caught on, hospitals in the 1840s had death rates higher than many battlefield medical units. The air in a crowded ward, the shared instruments, the unwashed hands. The hospital itself was often more dangerous than the disease that put you there. Now hold that fact next to this one. Skulls exist, more than 9,000 years old, showing clear evidence that a section of bone was deliberately removed from a living person's head, and that the person survived. We know this because the bone around the opening shows healing, meaning weeks or months passed with the patient alive and recovering. Some skulls show this procedure done more than once on the same person, meaning they survived it, healed, and somehow ended up back under the same tools a second time. How does a surgery performed with sharpened stone, outdoors, thousands of years before anyone understood infection, sometimes produce better survival odds than a supposedly advanced European hospital in the 1840s? The uncomfortable answer is that the ancient surgeon, working in open air with clean stone tools, may have accidentally avoided the exact conditions. Crowded wards, shared unwashed equipment that made 19th century hospitals so lethal. Sterility, it turns out, isn't a modern invention. Sometimes it's just an accident of circumstance. That same pattern, accidental correctness, arrived at through repetition rather than theory, shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. In a burial site in Iraq, archaeologists found a grave containing the remains of a Neanderthal, surrounded by unusually concentrated pollen from several distinct plant species. The leading interpretation is that these were placed there deliberately, not blown in by wind. Several of those plants are still used in herbal preparations today, and some have been studied in labs and shown to carry genuinely active compounds. A species that never developed writing, never developed germ theory, may have been practicing a form of plant-based medicine before modern humans even reached the region. Once modern humans spread across the planet, this pattern didn't fade. It multiplied. On separate continents with no contact between them, people independently discovered that chewing the bark of a particular tree reduced pain and fever. That bark contained a compound that would eventually become the chemical basis for aspirin. Ancient Egyptian medical texts recommended a particular bulb vegetable for its protective properties against illness. Modern lab studies have since confirmed it carries real antimicrobial activity. Golden spice, used for thousands of years in South Asian healing traditions, turns out to contain a compound with measurable anti-inflammatory effects, still studied by researchers today. None of these people had a lab. What they had was time, repetition, and attention. If a treatment didn't work, the patient often died. The treatment quietly disappeared from use. If it worked, it got remembered, refined, and passed down. That is, in its own brutal way, a functioning experiment run across thousands of generations, with humanity itself as the test subjects. Wounds tell a similarly strange story. Egyptian healers applied honey directly to open wounds, and it wasn't superstition. Honey's chemistry creates a genuinely hostile environment for bacteria, and a medically approved honey product is used in hospital wound care right now for infections that resist other treatment. Cultures across multiple continents packed wounds with specific mineral-rich clays, which modern testing shows do have antimicrobial properties. And then there's the detail that tends to make people flinch. Certain fly larvae, deliberately introduced onto an infected wound, will consume only dead and infected tissue while leaving healthy tissue untouched. Indigenous healers on multiple continents discovered this independently. Military field surgeons used it for centuries. And hospitals today still use a clinical version of exactly this technique on wounds that won't respond to modern antibiotics. Ancient people weren't guessing wildly. They were running the same experiment millions of times over and quietly keeping whatever worked. But survival wasn't only about what people did to treat illness, it was also about what their bodies had already learned to do without being told. Every population repeatedly exposed to a disease over many generations sees a shift. The individuals more naturally resistant survive and pass that resistance forward, while the disease itself weeds out the most vulnerable. It is a merciless, staggeringly costly process, but it produces populations hardened against specific local threats. This is part of why contact between distant populations, centuries later, proved so catastrophic in some regions when people from one continent, carrying diseases their ancestors had been building resistance to for generations, encountered people with no such inherited defense. The toll in some communities reached devastating proportions. It wasn't a matter of one population being stronger. It was a difference in what each set of ancestors had already survived. There's a newer piece to this story that ancient people never could have explained, but almost certainly benefited from anyway. Researchers studying the gut microbiomes of modern hunter-gatherer communities consistently find dramatically higher microbial diversity compared to industrialized populations, and higher diversity is linked to stronger immune regulation and lower rates of certain chronic conditions. Fermented foods appear independently across nearly every ancient culture on record, originally developed simply to keep food from spoiling. What that process also does, almost as a side effect, is flood the food with beneficial microorganisms, a naturally occurring version of what we now sell in bottles labeled probiotic. Ancient people weren't managing their microbiome on purpose. They just ate what worked, fermented what lasted, and stayed constantly in contact with soil and the microscopic life in it, and their gut bacteria may have quietly thanked them for it. Even the parts of ancient medicine that look purely symbolic hold up better than expected. When a community healer performed an elaborate ritual around a sick person, chanting specific herbs, fire, the visible presence of the whole community, some of it was ceremony with no direct chemical effect. But the patient's nervous system was still receiving a powerful signal. You are being cared for, people are actively fighting for you. Modern research shows that signal alone can measurably shift stress hormones, immune activity, and pain perception. This is the same effect modern medicine now studies under names like the placebo response and the documented influence of bedside manner on patient outcomes. Ancient healers had no name for it and no biological explanation, but they were using it deliberately long before anyone could prove it was real. None of this means ancient medicine could handle everything, and it's worth being honest about that. A ruptured appendix, solved today by a routine hour-long operation, was almost always fatal. Certain infections, once they crossed a certain threshold, not be stopped by any plant or poultice available. Childbirth carried enormous risk for both mother and child. A significant portion of children in many ancient populations did not reach adulthood, which drags average life expectancy figures down to numbers that look grim on paper, often in the 30s. That statistic hides something important. Someone who survived childhood and avoided violence or the dangers of childbirth had a real chance of living into their 50s, 60s, or beyond. Skeletons exist showing people who lived for decades with healed fractures, with severe joint disease, with old age itself. Ancient life was dangerous, not doomed. And here's the part that should really stay with you. Many of the threats that killed people in the ancient world are still killing people right now, in places without access to modern treatment. Malaria, tuberculosis, diarrheal disease in children remain ongoing realities for hundreds of millions of people alive today, not distant historical footnotes. The fact that most of the people watching this can walk into a building within a few miles and solve, in days, an infection that would have been a death sentence in 1850 is not a small thing. It's one of the genuine triumphs of the modern world, and it's easy to stop being amazed by it simply because it's always been there for you. So when you put it all together, the pollen deliberately placed beside a Neanderthal burial, skulls that survived brain surgery not once but twice, honey still fighting infections in hospitals today, the larvae doing precision tissue removal that surgeons still rely on. The real story isn't that ancient people were lucky, or primitive, or groping blindly in the dark. It's that they were relentless observers, running an uncontrolled experiment across hundreds of thousands of years, with no instruments except attention, memory, and each other. They didn't need to understand why something worked. They only needed to notice that it did, and pass that noticing on. And enough of what they noticed turned out to be true that it's still saving lives in hospitals today. Proof that the line between ancient superstition and modern science is a lot blurrier, and a lot more interesting than most people assume.